Let's talk about Gilgamesh. I'm sitting here working on my Akkadian homework for tomorrow. This semester we're working through the 12-tablet standard Babylonian version of Gilgamesh, and I figured I would give you a sort of behind-the-scenes look at how the study of ancient texts goes, and emphasize a little bit about how complicated a text like Gilgamesh is, despite how it's talked about in pop culture sometimes. So first of all, let's be really clear. Gilgamesh is a really cool collection of ancient texts, but it's not the first or oldest anything. We just need to be very skeptical about these absolutist claims like this generally. But also just Gilgamesh in particular is very interesting because it has such a long history, even in the ancient world, and then there's our reception of the text in our modern world, so it's just thousands and thousands of years. I want to recommend the pretty new translation of Gilgamesh by Sophus Hell, my colleague, and it has a really good, concise, and accessible introductory chapter that I really recommend reading if you want to get into sort of the different pieces of evidence that we're pulling from when we talk about the Gilgamesh epic. So the earliest texts about Gilgamesh that we have come from the 3rd millennium in the Sumerian language, and they're sort of smaller stories about some of the episodes that then are put together in later Akkadian texts into a big story that is known as an epic to us modern people. And basically, when we talk about the Epic of Gilgamesh, modern scholars are putting together a lot of different evidence from across different periods into one coherent translation, but we don't have one complete version of the entire story. We have most of it, but we're still missing some significant chunks, especially at the beginning, which sucks. But we're piecing together a bunch of different smaller chunks of text to put together a composite text that makes sense together as a story. So if you're reading a sort of pop culture translation of Gilgamesh, like Sophus's new edition, you're going to see texts like this, and it seems fairly straightforward. Sophus does a good job of explaining where there are breaks in the standard Babylonian version, and then supplies different text to fill in the blanks, like here's this section from an Ugaritic text, for example. But it's much more complicated than this. When I'm doing my Akkadian homework, this is what I'm looking at. So I'm looking at a composite copy of the cuneiform text that I'm trying to read from primarily, and then I have 2 different versions of the transliteration of the signs. This is Andrew George's version, and this is Simo Parpola's version. One of the things that Andrew George's edition is especially good for is looking at all of the different manuscripts or copies that we have of texts. So each of these letters in the left column represents a different manuscript or copy or fragment of a tablet or a whole tablet that has this line or these signs on it. So the capital letters are representing different tablets or fragments that were excavated from Kuyunjik, which is ancient Nineveh. So we can see that the B manuscript has all of these lines, but then we move to a different manuscript that has these lines, but H has both, for example. And then if we look at the bottom of the page, we can see notes about where there are differences between different copies of the tablet. So if we look at this note, for example, in line 10, in 2 different manuscripts, F and H, they write out the word for stela in Akkadian, but in some versions, they write out the Sumerian logogram for stela here, which is different from this writing. And there are also all kinds of notes indicating how George is thinking about this reconstruction. So if there are square brackets, these are things that are not written on the fragments that we have, but that George is reconstructing from perhaps parallels in other texts. And in his volume 2 of this book, he has really extensive notes for all of these things. If there are X's, these are signs that do not appear or are broken off of different manuscripts, and he doesn't have a guess for what they might be. If there are half square brackets, these you could see part of the sign, but not the complete sign. The things in parentheses are written with Sumerian logograms, which he then normalizes into Akkadian to the left of them. Also on this, you might see some accent marks, and these aren't actually marking like pronunciation accents, but are an old school system of Assyriological notation that I actually really hate. So if you watched my Sign of the Day videos, you know that syllables can be written in multiple ways. And so to differentiate between different ways of writing the same syllable, we number them in Assyriological literature. So there might be, this is she 1, there's a she 2, a she 3, there's a tomb 1 and tomb 2 and tomb 3, and here's tomb 4. But in older Assyriological literature, and even modern, we're moving away from it a little bit, but they use accent marks to denote this instead of putting numbers for 1 and 2, which is really frustrating for a new Assyriology student because you have to memorize just yet another thing, and it's another layer of inaccessibility and gatekeeping in Assyriology, in my opinion. But basically, if you see an acute accent like this is just representing that this is the second writing of the shu signs. So this is shu 2. There's not an example on this page, but the other direction of accent pointing to the right, the grave accent, represents the third reading of that syllable. We're just writing it with the accent mark diacritics instead of writing out the number for whatever reason. I think it was to save space and with typewriters at some point. But honestly, we just need to move away from that. But now you know, if you see a Akkadian transliteration, you know what's going on with the accents. They're not about pronunciation. They're about the polyvalence of cuneiform signs. So that ended up being a lot in not a very long video, but I just wanted to give you a little bit of a behind-the-scenes look at how Assyriology students actually work with texts. We don't just read translations. We're doing the translations ourselves, and it's often a pretty complicated process. It's nothing simple, and it's time-consuming, but that's what makes it fun, I think. And I just want to emphasize again that Gilgamesh is also complicated, and it's a really interesting text, of course, but it's a lot more complicated than I think pop culture gives it credit for, and we need to remember how cool and complicated it is, and how awesome ancient people are for writing it, and how cool it is that we can read it.